Have you ever noticed how quickly we compare ourselves to others? It can happen without even thinking. You see someone more successful, more confident, more attractive, and suddenly your mind starts measuring. Am I doing enough? Am I behind? Why are they better than me? This habit feels natural, almost automatic. But why do humans compare themselves in the first place? And why does it affect us so deeply? To understand this, we need to look at how the human mind is designed. In 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced something called social comparison theory. His idea was simple but powerful. Humans evaluate themselves by comparing to others. Because unlike physical measurements, there's no clear way to measure things like success, intelligence, beauty, self-worth. So instead, the brain uses other people as reference points. Festinger proposed that we are constantly asking, where do I stand compared to others? And this process happens automatically, often without awareness. Not all comparisons are the same. Psychologists later identified two main types: upward comparison, comparing ourselves to people we perceive as better; downward comparison, comparing ourselves to people we perceive as worse off. Upward comparison can sometimes motivate us, but more often, it leads to feelings of inadequacy. While downward comparison can temporarily boost confidence, it doesn't necessarily lead to growth. So the brain is constantly balancing between wanting to improve and wanting to feel secure. From an evolutionary perspective, comparison had a purpose. Humans lived in small social groups where status mattered. Your position in the group affected access to resources, social support, even survival. So the brain developed a sensitivity to where we stand socially. This is why comparison feels emotional. It's not just a thought, it's a signal about belonging, safety, and position. Even today, the brain still treats social comparison as something important, even if the context has completely changed. Modern technology has amplified this process dramatically. In the past, we compared ourselves to a small group of people. Today, we compare ourselves to hundreds, or even thousands, and not just to real lives, but to curated versions of reality. People tend to share their highlights, their achievements, their best moments, but rarely their struggles. This creates an unrealistic standard, and the brain doesn't always recognize that what it sees is selective, so the comparison becomes distorted. In 1997, researchers Strack, Schwartz, and Schneidinger conducted studies showing how comparison affects self-evaluation. Participants were asked questions about their own lives, but before answering, they were exposed to different types of information about others. The result? Their self-perception changed depending on who they compared themselves to. This demonstrated something important. Comparison doesn't just reflect how we feel, it actively shapes how we feel. Our sense of self is not fixed, it is influenced by context. Another important insight comes from research on relative deprivation. This concept explains why people can feel dissatisfied even when their situation is objectively good. Because the brain doesn't evaluate life in absolute terms, it evaluates it relatively. If someone around you is doing better, it can create a sense of lack, even if nothing in your life has actually changed. This is why comparison can be so powerful. It shifts perception. From a neuroscience perspective, comparison is linked to a system in the brain called the default mode network. This network is active when we are thinking about ourselves, reflecting, imagining others' opinions, replaying social situations. Research using brain imaging has shown that this network becomes active during self-referential thinking, and comparison is one of its main functions. So in many ways, comparison is not a flaw. It's part of how the brain constructs identity. If comparison can make us feel worse, why do we keep doing it? Because the brain is not designed for happiness. It is designed for adaptation. Comparison helps us identify gaps, adjust behavior, navigate social environments. But in modern contexts, this system can become overactive. Instead of helping us grow, it can trap us in cycles of self-judgment. While comparison is natural, our relationship with it can change. Research suggests that awareness plays a key role. When people recognize that comparison is happening, they become less controlled by it. Other approaches include reducing exposure to unrealistic standards, focusing on internal progress instead of external benchmarks, and practicing reflection without judgment. The goal is not to eliminate comparison, but to understand it. One of the most powerful drivers of comparison today is social media. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok create an environment where comparison is constant and unavoidable. In 2014, researchers Vogel, Rose, Roberts, and Eccles studied how social media affects self-esteem. They found that increased exposure to others' profiles was linked to lower self-evaluation. Why? Because people were comparing their real lives to carefully curated versions of others. On social media, we are not seeing reality. We are seeing highlights, moments of success, beauty, and achievement, often filtered, edited, and selected. But the brain doesn't always make that distinction. It reacts as if these comparisons are accurate, and over time, this creates a distorted sense of where we stand. There is also a paradox at the center of comparison. We compare ourselves to understand who we are, but the more we compare, the less stable our sense of self becomes. Because identity starts shifting depending on who we are observing. One moment we feel confident, the next we feel behind. This constant fluctuation can create emotional instability. In psychology, this is sometimes linked to contingent self-worth, a form of self-esteem that depends on external factors. When self-worth depends on comparison, it becomes fragile, because there will always be someone ahead and always someone behind. So the question becomes, what happens if we stop using others as the main reference point? Comparison doesn't just influence how we feel, it shapes who we believe we are. During adolescence and early adulthood, comparison plays a major role in identity formation. Psychologists like Erik Erikson, 1968, described identity as something that develops through interaction with others. We don't form a sense of self in isolation. We form it in relation to the people around us. By observing others, we begin to define what we value, what we want, what we reject, and who we think we should become. But there is a risk. If identity is built mainly through comparison, it can become unstable, because it depends on external references that are constantly changing. One moment, you feel aligned with who you are. The next, you question everything, simply because someone else appears to be ahead. This is why developing an internal sense of identity is so important. Not to eliminate comparison, but to prevent it from defining you. Maybe comparison is not the problem. Maybe unconscious comparison is. Because when we understand why we compare, we gain distance from it. And that distance creates choice. If you're curious about psychology, human behavior, and the deeper patterns of the human mind, don't forget to subscribe to Curious Humans. New videos every week. And I'd love to know, do you think comparison motivates you or holds you back? Let me know in the comments.